Well, thank you very much, Professor Wolford. Is this working fine? And Professor Lust, for your thoughtful opening remarks and for getting us started here today. I'd like to thank the Einaudi team for warmly welcoming me to the Cornell family, but also for the hard work of putting all of this together. It's quite an operation just to bring everybody together around a topic like this, so I appreciate that. I also want to recognize the Center's global scholars, as Professor Lust just did, 15 really amazing students that will be interrogating and really thinking critically about what international aid is and what it should be and how we can imagine it in the future. And last but not least, I'm really honored to be a moderator for this debate and to be working directly with Professors Barrett and Ndulo. A lot has already been said about them. This is really an amazing pair of human beings, but also scholars and practitioners. And I think they're going to bring so much to the debate. So I'm very, very excited about that. So two quick areas I'll briefly speak to, and then we'll get started. First, three general goals I think that we'd like to accomplish, building on what our speakers have already said. First is understanding the complexities of international aid. There's a lot of levels, and it's really complex. And once you start opening up the black box of that term, it gets complicated in a hurry. And so we really want to come away from the next hour and a half understanding that a little better. Second, what are the implications of cutting this assistance, right? Is it good? Is it not good? You know, those are the issues we'll be thinking. And last but not least, what's next? You know, we're in a new normal now in terms of international aid, and we really need to think critically and smartly about what's next. And I have no doubt that the colleagues to my left and right will do that. Briefly, for the ground rules, very simple ground rules, not a lot of rules actually to speak, right? 5 minutes each, thereabouts, for opening statements. Then we'll, in alphabetical order, we'll take Professor Barrett first, and then Professor Ndulo for these brief opening statements. Then I'll ask some questions to stimulate some discussion, highlight some differences, but also identify the common ground that we know really exists between both of them, and I think between many people in this room. Last but not least, we're going to open up the floor to your questions. And so with that said, let me ask Professor Barrett to get us started.
Great. Thank you so much, Paul, and thank you, Ellen, for the invitation, and Wendy for hosting all of this. When I was asked to participate in this debate, I had to think very carefully, because in my undergraduate class, do you all hear me? I feel like I'm getting lots of feedback. In my undergraduate class, Contemporary Controversies in the Global Economy, I often teach a module on foreign aid. And I make a point in all the modules to lay out both sides of the argument and to expressly not take a position so that students don't feel like, oh, I have to just parrot back to the professor what he said. So I had to weigh the hazard of tipping my hand. But I thought the opportunity to do a debate with my longtime friend and colleague, Muna Ndulo, was just too tempting. So thank you for this opportunity. And thank you for those of you who took time to come. I know at least a couple of you heard that I would wear a coat and tie. That was such an uncommon event that I think that's what drew you to see if I actually own such things. So thank you. Take your picture now. It might never again happen. So more seriously, let me state very clearly from the outset my position on the question we're debating. We need more, not less aid. We need it for moral reasons, for security reasons, and for economic reasons, but it needs to be different, fundamentally different than it has been in the past. And in particular, we need less bilateral aid, that is government-to-government aid to support country-specific things, and we need far more aid for what some of us term international public goods, for things that cut across the global community, things like humanitarian response, agricultural R&D, biomedical research, especially infectious disease monitoring and prevention, climate change mitigation. These are things that we underinvest in massively, and there is demonstrable return to doing more of that. So the landscape has changed markedly in the last 9 months. These issues have been around for decades. There's nothing new about the issues, but the moment is different, And as the old adage goes, we shouldn't waste a good crisis. Just to make sure everybody starts from the same basic of facts, in 2024, global aid flows, as reported by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the main international organization that tracks aid, they reported $212 billion in aid flows that year, which was actually down a little bit from the year before. But aid overall has been increasing fairly steadily, even in inflation-adjusted terms. So this is the first time we've seen a downturn in some time. But keep in mind that that's, as Wendy said, a drop in the bucket. That is not only far less than trade flows, it's far less than international remittances, the money sent back by workers living outside their home country, the money they send back to families and communities, is roughly 3 times as much as international aid. So the labor force migration has a much bigger financial flow effect than does aid. And private investment by firms and individuals is likewise significantly larger than international aid. So we're talking about a relatively small chunk of change, but $200+ billion isn't nothing. So I am going to try to distinguish between bilateral aid, as I said, one government to another. The U.S. sending money to Zambia for projects run by the government of Zambia or NGOs operating in Zambia, as just an example for my Zambian friend, versus those that are going to international public goods. And the core argument is we need to be increasing funding of international public goods, and we should pay for part of that through reduced bilateral aid. But the total portfolio has got to enlarge for the simple reason that we're underinvested, for reasons I'll explain in a moment. One key form of international public goods is humanitarian aid. We all live in communities that have a fire department, that have an emergency response system with ambulances. You don't know which person is going to have a crisis, and the odds are reasonably good that it's not their fault, that there's just some freak event that happens that precipitates a need to respond. And that's what the humanitarian response system globally is. Think of it as the fire department for the world. Would you want to live in a community without a fire department? The answer is probably no, because we need rapid response to prevent permanent catastrophic damage. Get there, put the kitchen fire out quickly. Yes, you've got damage, but the place isn't a complete loss. More importantly, no loss of life. So the humanitarian imperatives to save lives and livelihoods wherever the need is, without prejudice with regard to any attribute of the affected peoples, is a fundamental principle of emergency response. And there will always be people in acute need. That's why we need the system. The humanitarian response budget portion of aid has been increasing dramatically. So we think of aid as shrinking, but in fact, humanitarian response has increased. The funds spent on humanitarian response has increased roughly double over the last 20 years, and that's largely because there are more people affected by disasters. We are at a record post-World War II number of internally displaced persons and refugees, people who've left their home country and gone to some other country, not because they're looking for better work, but because they needed to flee. So these responses are growing because of a very clear need. To be clear, the humanitarian response budget globally never meets assessed needs. On average, it's a little less than 50%. So we're fairly miserly, but because the need has grown so fast, that budget has increased sharply. The problem is that it's been financed by redirecting funds away from longer-term investments in development that helps to shock-proof standards of living so that when food prices spike, when a drought hits, when there's an earthquake, communities have the resources internally to recover. And this is the thing that we need to combat right now. We need to continue to ideally expand humanitarian response budgets, but invest sharply in increasing R&D that can help us to reduce over time the need to rely on this. By building communities' resilience, you reduce the need for international humanitarian response. And that's the strategy we really need to be pursuing. It is not the strategy we have been pursuing. So predictably, when we dial back investments in innovations that help people shock-proof, improve standards of living, we see more people falling into disasters, more people fall into poverty traps, and we trap ourselves in a grisly game of whack-a-mole as the international community. We're just trying to stop a problem wherever it bounces up. And if you think of that whack-a-mole game, the pace at which the moles pop up just keeps accelerating, which makes it that much harder to invest in, turn the thing off. That's what we need to be doing. So the solution is big increases in R&D investments, especially in agri-food systems innovation, I'll explain why in just a moment, and infectious disease monitoring and prevention. Agri-food systems innovation has lagged. The United States government, over the last 20 years, has reduced by 30% its public investment in agricultural R&D, and the international community of agricultural research centers has had a budget fall in inflation-adjusted terms of about 40% in 10 years. So it's no surprise that the pace of innovation is slowing. And the pace of innovation slowing means a slower rate of growth in food supply. As populations grow, as incomes grow, that's resulted in dramatic food price increases. Today, we have nearly 3 billion people around the world who can't afford a healthy diet. And today we have food prices that, relative to 2002, are roughly 55% higher in inflation-adjusted terms. So that's takeout inflation, just the relative price of food. So poor people struggle, and when you can't find food for your family, you leave. So this is part of the problem of refugees. Part of the problem with investing in these longer-term solutions for tropical diseases like malaria or schistosomiasis, or improving the productivity of small farmers in Africa, Latin America, and Asia, is that we don't identify with this problem. The global upper middle class and upper class largely doesn't worry about feeding our children at night. We don't worry about our child getting dengue fever. These are just unfamiliar problems, so we have a very hard time imagining that threat faced by communities all around the world. But again, 2.7 billion people, are at risk of not being able to afford a healthy diet. This is actually a normal condition around the world. But because we don't identify, we don't invest in it. It's very hard for us to relate. So we need to think about this in terms that will motivate policymakers. One of them is security. I had the privilege to spend a week with 19 members of Congress in Muna's home country of Zambia in August, and the primary topic of discussion around U.S.-Africa relations was U.S. security interests. Yeah, they're sort of interested in the humanitarian stuff, but really they're interested in the power politics of what's Russia doing, what's China doing, where are terrorist threats, et cetera. A hungry world is a dangerous world. Food security not only is caused by conflict, it causes conflict. There's very good evidence on this. Moreover, a sick world is a dangerous world. Just think about the pandemic. We can't keep our population healthy if we don't help populations elsewhere to stay healthy themselves. Too easy for infectious disease to cross boundaries very quickly. So the security interests clearly call for investing more in infectious disease monitoring and prevention, and investing in agricultural R&D and food systems more broadly to boost especially productivity among smallholder farmers in their communities. There's also, aside from the humanitarian reason, a strong economic rationale. So that the multiplier on U.S. government expenditures, that is, for every dollar the U.S. government spends domestically, how much added expenditure is there in the economy as federal workers go out and spend their paychecks at a grocery store or at a movie theater? That's what we economists call a multiplier, the added economic kick. So the average government multiplier in the U.S. is between 30 cents and $1.50, depending upon what you want to count and how you like to estimate. There's a lot of interest these days in cash transfer programs to the poor. Cash transfer programs to the poor in the developing world, the best estimates now are the multiplier is about $2.50 you get for every dollar you spend. The return on investment in nutrition programming for young children, under 5, preschool-age children, and in agricultural R&D ranges from 23 to 40. 30 cents to $1.50. $1.50 if you're doing well on regular expenditures in the US versus $40. This is not a fair competition. And the basic reason is we're underinvested. So they're diminishing returns. If we were well invested in agricultural R&D, in nutrition programs for pregnant and lactating women and under 5 children, we would see those returns come way down so that it starts to approach what it's like just giving out cash to families, even poor families who spend all of it. But it's not. That's a very clear economic signal that we're underinvested. We've spent money on short-term fixes because they buy us political capital, and we're underinvesting in the long run. And this is the big change that needs to happen. The long-run investments in international public goods, especially in R&D, are the thing that has been most starved and we need to reinforce. So why don't I stop there and respond later on? Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. That was a very helpful, very thoughtful opening statement. Professor Ndulo?
Okay. Thank you very much for inviting me to come to this discussion, and thank you to the Center for making this possible and for all the arrangements that have been made. I'm delighted to debate my friend Chris, and I think we more or less on the same page, but of course my emphasis will be slightly different. My approach to the whole thing first is that, problems never come in compartments, you know. It's never like just law or economics or this. Everything is actually always related. And I think this is how we have to examine this aid, issue. So I'll try to answer a series of questions which I posed to myself about the aid debate. First, I think historically, the original aim of aid was to help alleviate, a country's social and problems without changing or altering any of the social structures in the country. But since then, of course, this has really changed. Now, development aid has undergone a transformation from traditional aid to what is now termed as development cooperation, partnerships, or development assistance. And of course, as my colleague made the distinction that you have on one hand humanitarian aid and developmental aid. I think there's very little argument about humanitarian aid in the sense that it's addressing obvious needs, disasters, and things like that. Now, I think with the transformation, there has come varied views about the aid effectiveness and the need for aid itself. And this raises the question really as to whether aid actually supports development. And this has become a big issue, I think, in terms of debate, especially given what we are facing now in terms of the cuts. There are those who, of course, who take the view that aid has failed or has achieved very little, and that development aid has no effect on the speed with which countries develop. Now, of course, there are also those that argue that aid is mostly misused or stolen by corrupt leaders or wasted on ineffective programs. And yet another argument holds that for a variety of reasons, aid does not work even when it gets to the intended recipients, that you still have a problem. It's also pointed out that there is a contradiction in the sense that the aid givers, the countries that give aid, the same countries oppose any reforms at WTO level in terms of agriculture, which would actually help those countries more than the aid that's being given. So we all are aware of the Doha the negotiations have been deadlocked for a long time. So the result is that, for example, if we take the question of cotton, the United States heavily subsidizes cotton farmers here. And what effect does that have on poor countries like Niger that produce really good cotton? They can't sell their cotton because the US cotton is cheap. So it's the same countries in the sense that the amount of money we're talking about, you probably could achieve it by reforming, the trading arrangements without really just giving these handouts. And this is where I think the issue comes in of effectiveness, that you're pushing development, but at the same time, you're preventing development using the trading system in the world. As you are aware, the WTO functions by agreements on specific sectors. And the problem has been that there's been no agreement on agriculture, and that allows countries in the developed sector to actually continue to subsidize things like cotton, beef, and etc. Also, there are several factors, I think, that militate against aid effectiveness. The issue of the procurement regulations, that when you get aid, major part of the requirement is that you have to buy all your supplies, and the experts have to come from the country that gave you the aid. So that's another issue in terms of whether you could have gotten those services much more cheaply on the open market than this. So the goods and services had to be procured from there. So there is this aspect which is often not brought out openly. Now, the recent cuts of aid by the US are actually not unique to the US. It's part of a global general trend amongst donor nations. The UK, France, and Germany have cut aid. And of course, in terms of impact, the health and governance related sectors are the ones that are mostly impacted by, for example, USAID cuts. We must also remind ourselves that actually, although we speak sometimes of aid positively, and I'm not here saying that it's not positive, as I said, there's no compartments here. Things can be good on one side and terrible on the other side. The aid-giving countries have actually never met the commitments that were given at in international forums, that they should give something like 0.70% of GDP to aid. In fact, throughout these years, only 5 countries.
Can I interrupt? Can we have you try this mic instead?
I use this one. Okay. So only 5 countries have actually ever met that yardstick. That's Denmark, Germany, Luxembourg, Norway, and Sweden. Now, also it's interesting that while there is this downward trend in terms of aid, there is increased military spending. Between 2015, I think this is statistics from UNCTAD, I think, that between 2015 and 2024, world military expenditure has risen by 37%, with the steepest rise happening between 2023 and 2024. And actually, in this sphere, Europe is leading in terms of the increase in military spending, followed by Asia, and then America, and in Africa as well. Now, why should we care about the reduction of aid? That, there is, and this, of course, is happening in the context of the rise of multipolarity. And this will escalate global geopolitical competition. Consequently, what will happen, in my view, is that high-income countries will more nakedly condition their aid giving on strategic foreign policy objectives. As the competition grows, they will in fact now demand more in terms of actually that you have to pursue their strategic foreign policy objectives. And I think we should also expect that these countries will more explicitly lean on multilateral organizations for the same ends, in terms of pushing the aid in those organizations towards their goals. So I think they will see much more influence in those organizations like the World Bank, the IMF, and specific UN agencies. And this, I think, will intensify in the medium and long term. So now the other issue is the question of the elites in the low-income countries. That may be one of the things that might happen with respect to the crisis in aid, is that this will cure elites in low-income countries of their unexplainable naivety and acceptance of aid dependence as a matter of course. I think we must admit that generally this long period of aid has led to this acceptance of aid as a must. And I think more importantly, hopefully it will bring states back in on the driving seat of setting their own development agendas. Decades of deputizing non-state actors to lead the push for structural change have yielded very few wins, mostly, as we noted, in the public health area and disaster areas and all that. It will be a net positive if these organizations and other development players, including foundations, think tanks, and philanthropists, did not loaden the externalization of policy priorities of high-income countries. So I think this is a much bigger problem than most people like to admit. I think given the ideation and operational influence that these institutions have on political players in low-income countries, and I think we need to pay attention to that. And although most of the discussions of aid focuses on its impact on least developed countries, abolishing aid also hurts countries like the US in terms of their interests. The US influence in reducing conflicts in the world and promotion of democracy, it would reduce its soft power, definitely. Efforts to prevent terrorism will be affected, efforts to prevent life-ending or debilitating illnesses and the global spread of disease. As the AIDS epidemic demonstrated to us, no country is exempt from global diseases. A constant feature in the field of development is the firm belief by most of the pivotal players involved that low-income countries will always be poor and desperately in need of foreign assistance. I think this mentality shapes the sort of solutions that get fostered on those countries, many of which continues to be held by low ambition leaders that eagerly accept one failing project after another. Evidence neither makes nor implements policy. Cross-pressured people do. It follows that over-indexing on the hunt for what to do at the expense of learning how to solve problems is a losing game. Now, in the context of aid, of course, we mostly talk about the West. Now, clearly, China is also beginning to play a huge role in this field. Although one notices that China plays a different, employs a different approach to the aid issue. And here, I think they tend to focus on using their aid to promote Chinese trade. And I think Mo Ibrahim report, for example, points out that ever since the establishment in 1994 of the Export-Import Bank of China, it has used more loans than any other Chinese bank to foreign buyers of Chinese goods and services. So they're very focused on aiding countries to buy things from China. Now, while the extent of US aid cuts and the cuts from other countries, they seemed unexpected, they're actually signaling a broader trend long in the making. And I think we just have to get used to this, that this is going to be the trend. Part of the reason is that some traditional donors have lost faith in the convictions that underpinned aid. The notion that our future prosperity and their future prosperity would go hand in hand is no longer really held by all. While this is still true, there's also the problem that the populations in some of these countries are no longer convinced about the need for aid. The world has changed, and we are not likely to return to the familiar status quo anytime soon. And I think we better get used to that. Now, the Director General of WTO, Ngozi Iweala, commenting on the trend in terms of diminishing aid, she observed that while it is tragic in the short term, it's the future which, for different reasons, we all embrace as necessary, and if done right, offering predictable long-term finance to support countries in their development. If you look at, as I think Chris pointed out with respect to remittances, if you look at the aid received, you find that in 2023, for example, the aid to Africa from all donors totaled 73.6 billion. This is less than the continent received in remittances, because the remittances amounted to 90.8 billion. In addition, the continent actually received more foreign direct investment than aid also. They received 97.1 billion. And tax revenue within Africa itself was also much, much higher than the aid, and that was 479.7 billion. So in the equation of, in terms of the money flow, you really see that aid, it plays an important role, but is not as significant as is actually often put out to be. Now, on the same issue, the Secretary General of the Africa Free Trade Area has observed that, referring to the tariffs as well as the aid cuts, and I think in particular here, he was referring to the fact that the Trump administration has in fact ended the AGOA agreement with Africa, which was a free trade between the US and Africa. And he said, and I quote him, "The tariffs imposed by Trump provide an opportunity for Africa to pivot from dependence and external support to self-sufficiency. Africa must realize that its future hinges on trade and not aid. Financial aid will not be adequate for funding efforts to accelerate economic growth and poverty alleviation. Ultimately, we have to look for other sources of finance." And I think one of the points that often made is the role that private sector can play if conditions are created for it to grow. They can serve as a source of much needed capital. But I would like to emphasize the point I made, that as we look at the impact of aid, we should not forget the point that I made with respect to the WTO negotiations, the terms of trade. If you look at the current system of trading, it doesn't matter whether you're exporting copper or cocoa, the producers in the developing countries have no role in setting the price. The price of copper is set by the London Metal Exchange, cocoa agreement, you have all this. So it's one-sided. And here I would like to end by quoting Nyerere as far back as 1974. He was commenting about this situation. And he said that our international systems and institutions need to be reformed so they are fit for the purpose of our fast-changing world. In particular, he said, and I quote, "The complaint of the poor nations against the present state of affairs is not only that we are poor, both in absolute terms and in relative terms, in comparison with the rich nations. It is also that within the existing structures of economic interaction, we must remain poor and get relatively poor whatever we do." And I think that's a very relevant comment in terms of the role of aid, in the sense that if we focus more on fairer ways of trading, we might not need as much aid as we are asking for. And in any event, there doesn't seem to be a country that has actually developed as a result of aid. So I think it's very relevant to consider that factor, that on one hand, you have the push for more aid, but the givers of aid are also responsible for stalling negotiations, for example, in Doha, to bring about fair trading terms. So I think I will end there and look forward to your questions. Thank you.
So it's the disagreements aren't around the need for us to engage countries in the global South. I think the perspectives and the approaches are a little bit different. I'd like to draw that out a little bit. I was hearing Professor Barrett talking a lot about, and correctly so, I think the importance of humanitarian aid. That's a hard thing for anyone to be disagreeing with. So humanitarian aid, I think there's a consensus here, clearly, and that's really important. But the focus, your focus on focusing on R&D, especially around biomedical issues and agriculture and agro-processing, is really important and really interesting. I guess the question I would ask you is, the devil is always in the details. Is it really a debate between bilateral versus international public goods, or is it a debate about the topic or the focus of aid, and then how do we deliver it? Because I can see opportunities for bilateral aid to actually address those issues. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about the devil is in the details of who would actually deliver the aid. And Professor Ndulo, this was very interesting because it goes to the heart of the issue around trade and the importance of international trade. And there's been a lot of research and a lot of discussion on trade versus aid, which I think is a really important distinction to make, especially when you look at issues around procurement of the actual international development assistance and the tide aid, and of course the issues you brought up around sort of local governance and how they're able to manage that and how they have great dependency. What I would love to actually hear you both address is the other person's points. I would love to hear you tell us a little bit more about what do you think about Professor Barrett's focus on supporting R&D and focusing on humanitarian assistance as the bulwark for a new international aid infrastructure architecture. And I would also love to hear your thoughts on maybe focusing less on humanitarian assistance and the very detailed and clear way that you shared with us, and more on, so where does trade fit into this? And this way we can sort of switch perspectives and hear what you both have to say. Maybe you can start, because we can go back and forth.
Sure, thanks. And thank you, Muna, for those ideas, very clear. Trade it would be very strange for an economist to argue that trade doesn't matter. Trade is hugely important. The challenge is coming to agreement, as a lawyer can understand. The Uruguay Round Agreement on agriculture, the only trade agreement we've ever struck in the world around agriculture, was agreed in 1994. And that was a time when tariffs were coming down, and the concern was that you wanted to get governments to stop protecting their markets against cheap imports. Since the turn of the millennium, the issue has been, with a few exceptions like cotton, the issue has been far more governments imposing export bans. Again, we're in an era of prices rising, food prices rising, as food demand has far outpaced food supply growth around the world. And so we are increasingly seeing that at crucial moments, key exporters just close the ports. India, Russia, Vietnam, China just refuse to allow their producers to export because they're trying to keep prices low domestically, and that's just exporting inflation to other countries, especially vulnerable countries that don't have extensive lines of credit, so they can't easily go get replacement imports. So negotiating new trade agreements, when the issues have flipped to the other side, how do we negotiate export disciplines, not just import disciplines? And obviously the US government has complicated things enormously by suddenly restoring 1920s era tariffs. But what was already a big challenge that took decades to address 30 years ago is a really formidable challenge. So I'm unfortunately fairly pessimistic about the prospects for us making progress on international trading relationships, simply because there are such varied perspectives on this across the key players. Arguably, India is the biggest obstacle to a WTO agreement right now, which might strike some of you as crazy. How could that possibly be? But India is a massive exporter of particular products, and it really wants disciplines on the import side, but not on the export side, because it wants the freedom to turn off exports when it needs to. And that's just a non-starter with many other players. So I do think trade is terribly important. Frankly, I think the movement of people is far more important. The migration policies in this country and in lots of countries, not just the United States, help keep people from going to where their skills can be best used. And there's abundant evidence. Indeed, our colleague Johannes Hossauffer, a faculty member in the Brooks School and Department of Economics, has launched an NGO called Malengo in Uganda, where he gets promising Ugandan students coming from low-income families and gets them a German university education. Pays for, he's got an NGO for this, pays for the entirety of their learning there. Keep in mind, German universities are free within Germany, so it's not as expensive as sending someone to Cornell would be. It helps arrange visas, et cetera. And they've mapped this with a really interesting research design where they have established that there are these big benefits, not just to the Ugandan who goes to Germany, but there are equally big benefits for the friends and family left behind, partly through remittances, partly through just the satisfaction that comes from knowing your loved one is succeeding someplace else. I think this experiment that Johannes is running is, in microcosm, a really telling example of where we should be focusing. We need to focus on helping people to realize their potential, which is partly through not messing up markets too badly through trade barriers so that they can produce according to their comparative advantage in their home country, but partly it's letting them go to where their skills will be rewarded. And aid is a relatively minor piece compared to both of those.
Thank you very much. Would you like to respond?
Yeah. Thank you for the comments, Chris. Yeah. I think that on the humanitarian aid, I think we've really no dispute. I think we all agree that humanitarian aid and aid focusing on disease control. I mean, one has to look at the significant role that aid has played in, for example, vaccinations for children and all that sort of thing. So that's, I think, not in dispute. And I think a lot of the debate is around the question of economic aid as to whether it is achieving the desired results. Is that the way to go? Now, I take a different view in terms of the trade situation, because the trade system in the world was built out of a historical context, in terms of colonies and all that. And it still reflects that. If you go today, to Ghana, they produce, cocoa beans and all that, but all the manufacturing in terms of chocolates and everything, we all know Switzerland and Belgium as actually the centers, but they don't produce any of the raw materials. And as long as these countries remain producing raw materials, they will not get anywhere. It doesn't matter how much raw materials you produce. The question is added value, that, let them, at least invest in manufacturing, in producing goods they can sell. And I think that applies even when you come to minerals. Whether you're looking at copper, I mean, we have countries in Africa, Zambia, the Congo, they've been producing copper for over 100 years. Do you know, up to today, they still export copper bars. That's all. And the countries that are producing and manufactured goods from the copper, South Korea, Japan, they don't have any copper. So and I think that's what Nyerere was trying to point out, that there is this problem that it reflects the colonial setup, and that's continued. And the negotiations fail, and I mean, the idea, of course, of trade is comparative advantage, but we see that it doesn't always seem to work the way we think it should be working. So I think that there's really need to look at this in the sense that, because to me, that would reduce the need for aid, in the sense that these countries will be on their own without the humiliation of always asking for money. And I think the problem with aid, to me, it's also that it creates a mentality of dependence. You begin to think that all the time somebody is going to come and help you to do this. And you don't look at yourselves and your resources. I mean, another example in terms of Ghana, I think, with the palm oil, and compare it to Malaysia, where it said that actually the Malaysians went to Ghana to get the seeds for palm oil. Today, Malaysia, I think, is $1 billion industry in terms of the products from palm oil, and Ghana is still producing palm oil and nothing else. So I think these are things that, to me, if addressed, and if the aid is focused on that, to build capacity in these countries. So education, for example, so that it in fact can produce people who can invent things that can be done, and that way increase. And I think that's just one last point in terms of the trade thing. One of the problems of integration in Africa, and I think we all acknowledge that it's the least in the world in terms of intra-trade. Highest is Europe, of course, then the Americas and Asia. Africa is like 18% or so trading with each other. But part of the problem is two. One, what do they sell each other? The things they need are not produced in Africa. What does Zambia say buy for Malawi? There's nothing. They are producing the same things. So those are challenges, I think, which we have to face in terms of the way we look at aid and the role it can play. I agree that channeling aid through multilateral institutions would be useful, but again, you have to look at who is actually the control of those institutions. And I think with the cuts in aid, it's going to be more, because it's going to mean that the countries that are giving aid would demand more in terms of what they get out of it, as opposed to when there was not this. So you have to address the institutions, because these institutions have been there too, for a long time. The World Bank, IMF, whatever we look at, and they can be channels to do that. And you can also see it in terms of transport. If you look at the structure of transport networks in say, developing countries, the railway lines are always from a mine to the port. They're never internal. They don't connect the country in any way. And that's true of most of the. So there are a lot of things which I think if we have aid, then it should be properly directed in terms of what it's actually trying to resolve. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me just ask one quick last question, and then we can move it on to the global scholars and to others in the audience. And that has to do around the issue of building capacity and just the actual practical elements of addressing some of the issues. Whether it's strengthening a global trade regime or building the humanitarian response abilities of both the global north and global south, capacities need to be built on both sides of the equation, for sure, knowledge and capacities. Help us to understand how we would go about doing that in a meaningful way. And I think that's a bridge to kind of this question about what should this new architecture look like? Like, how can we address whether it's building a better global trade regime or strengthening humanitarian response? How can we do it in the future? It's a very new normal now. So 2 or 3 minutes, if you could just share a couple of thoughts, and then I can pass it over to him, and then we'll bring it out to the open.
So capacity building is one of those terms that has been used for a very long time, and it's a Rorschach test. People see in it whatever it is that they want to see. For some people, it's training negotiators so they can go to Geneva and do a better job negotiating the next WTO agreement. For other people, it's K-12 education. For still others, it's tertiary education, because there's such a youth bulge in many low-income countries. I mean, the median age in Africa is 19 right now. So there's this massive population that's going to be moving through universities. Even when a very small share of the population goes to university, the scale of the expansion is daunting. So which of these is capacity building? They all are at some level. And this gets to a fairly fundamental question about who bears the responsibility and who captures the gains. There's an old principle called subsidiarity that some of you are probably familiar with. That's the idea that you should put authority and responsibility at the lowest level that captures the gains. And there's a lot of evidence that in especially K-12 and tertiary education, the gains really stay fairly local. There are clearly gains that come from, for example, the Philippines has very strong programs in nursing. So the United States has an extraordinarily large number of nurses trained in the Philippines. A very interesting recent study showed that when the US relaxed immigration restrictions on Philippine nurses, far more Filipinos, mainly Filipinas, went to school, trained as nurses, many came to the US, but the number of qualified licensed nurses in the Philippines increased 9-fold. This was brain gain. Because the opportunity to come to the US was so appealing, they pursued nursing studies and accumulated lots of talent that stayed domestically. I offer that example because it's important to keep in mind 2/3 of the world's poor live in middle-income countries. We think about the poor as living in low-income countries, but that's just outdated. The single country with the most extreme poor people in the world is India. India is an aid donor. We have to deal with the problem that countries need to bear responsibility for educating their own children. We need to do a better job educating our own children in the United States. And the fact that most of the poor communities that need capacity building in terms of education are themselves middle-income countries only underscores the need for governments to step up and take responsibility for their own populations. I think it's increasingly hard to support the argument that we should be supporting education in India, in other upper middle income countries. But it is crucial to build the capacity to innovate, to do the things that will transform sectors. You know, Kenya is way ahead of the United States in mobile money, for those who aren't aware. I mean, the single largest banking system in Kenya is on people's phones. It's not in bricks and mortar buildings. And that came through innovation that grew up organically. In that case, it was entirely privately funded. And one of the best uses of aid right now is to crowd in private resources. We talk about $200+ billion of aid flows, but just the 500 companies publicly traded and listed on the Standard & Poor's 500 sit on more than $2 trillion in cash at this moment. That's money that they're investing at a return of 1% to 2% a year, incredibly low returns. They're just sitting on it. There's no reason for them to invest in the problems of the poor because they know that poor people can't afford to pay a premium for products to recoup their investment costs. But we've learned some lessons about how to do this. So the Gavi program, for example, the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunizations, would commit money that if you come up with the following discovery, we guarantee you a market that will earn a profit. And Gavi, as a result, induced, for example, induced pneumococcal vaccines that have saved the lives of about 300 million children around the world at a cost of less than $9,000 per life saved. That's a pittance. And it was all done with private money. It was just putting up money in the form of aid money to guarantee there will be a market. You go out and figure out the discovery. We could do the same thing for lots of discoveries that are needed to solve problems in low-income and lower middle-income countries, but we're not thinking creatively about how do we get the private sector to step up and fund those. The capacity can emerge organically, just as it did with M-Pesa in Kenya.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. I agree with most of what Chris has said on this. But not much to add except to emphasize that education is really key, in terms of building capacity in a lot of these countries. And the unfortunate thing is that the standards and quality of education has actually fallen in a lot of least developed countries because of funding issues and all those things. And there's also, of course, need to rework curriculums. A lot of them are very much oriented to a job in the civil service and things like that. And yet the needs of industry are different. So we need to kind of examine the kind of education that's going on to make it more relevant in terms of the needs of the various sectors of industry. And I see this as a major problem, especially that in a lot of the least developed countries, populations are growing at a very rapid rate. So you really have a huge task in terms of expenditures on education. So we need to plan. And I think that's a role where you can produce results, in terms of even aid. If it's focused on such things, you can actually see what the impact it can have. Yeah, thank you.